I'm Jane Patton. I'm a campaigns manager for plastics and petrochemicals with the Center for International Environmental Law. I also helped co-found No Waste Louisiana based in New Orleans. And I am very excited and also a little bit concerned to be talking with you guys about this problem today. So with that, there is no doubt that the climate is in crisis. From the hurricane seasons that just won't quit, to the constant threats of land loss and historic flooding over and over and over again, and summers that are actually hotter from when we were kids, Louisiana is feeling that climate crisis acutely. Louisiana's people are suffering from those impacts, but the state's industries are also a source of a lot of the greenhouse gases being emitted that are affecting the climate and putting it in crisis. This is a map provided by Dr. Kolker, who's on the call with us today, about greenhouse gas emissions in Louisiana from large facilities. And actually, our partners at Healthy Gulf helped us zoom this map out a little bit to see that those greenhouse gas emissions are also coming from Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. They're coming offshore in the Gulf itself. All of these industries in the 5 states of the Gulf are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and contributing to the climate crisis. But this is not a done deal. There are actually lots of things that can be done to stop the climate crisis. The state of Louisiana, as some of you know, right now has convened, as per the governor's executive order, a climate initiatives task force that consists of 25 to 30 people across multiple sectors and industries. It's also comprised by a number of advisory groups and a number of sector committees, which you can see displayed here. And they are having conversations about what to do about the climate crisis in Louisiana. Unfortunately, for those of us who've been watching this process, we know that that task force is predominantly white, it is predominantly male, and it is vastly overpopulated by industry and some nonprofit representatives who are openly advocating for the solution of carbon capture and storage. And that's actually what brings us to today's teach-in. Why are we concerned about this? Why is it a problem that it is being so focused on in the climate task force? And what can we as people do about that? So let's start with a little bit about what carbon capture and storage is. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, is the theory that the carbon emissions that come from coal and gas-fired power plants can be captured. They can be filtered off of the emissions from these facilities before they're released into the atmosphere and then stored underground indefinitely. You might recognize it by its other marketing monitor that it had for a few decades, which was clean coal. Carbon capture and storage and clean coal are the same idea and the same technology that has been talked about for quite a long time. And there are 5 things that you actually need to know about carbon capture and storage that you need to be able to tell your family, your friends, your neighbors, anybody that you talk to them about carbon capture and storage in Louisiana. And the 5 things that you need to remember is that carbon capture and storage is not a climate solution. Louisiana is a target. Carbon pipelines are very dangerous. Residents will pay the costs of carbon capture and storage, and carbon capture and storage focuses on the wrong thing. So let's take each of those points in turn and dive a little bit more deeply in them. Why is carbon capture and storage not a climate solution? There is an increasing amount of money and, frankly, propaganda around carbon capture and storage, around using it for industrial emissions to get to what they're calling net zero. And I say that with air quotes because anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that net zero is not zero. It is not zero emissions. A surprisingly high number of studies and analysis have been published over the last 10 years calling for a massive build out of carbon capture and storage. That's compared to very few actual deployments of carbon capture and storage. Many of the technologies that are theorized in these studies are openly not even going to be available until after 2050. So if we are trying to get to net zero by 2050, and these technological applications are not available until then, seems kind of irrelevant for us to be focusing so much on them right now. And in fact, the carbon capture and storage that we have tried, after decades of research, flagship projects have failed in the last few years because carbon capture and storage is not feasible, it is not economical, and billions of the public's money, billions of dollars of the public's money have been spent, and it is still not working. In fact, less than 0.1%, less than 0.010% of carbon emissions are actually being captured right now. And feasibly, even if we were to build out all the carbon capture and storage technology that proponents are theorizing and supporting, we could still only capture less than 8% of carbon emissions. And y'all, that's not a fact from an extremist advocate or activist. This is Chevron's own scientists who have put out peer-reviewed research that says that we can only feasibly capture a fraction of the overall percentage of carbon emissions. And from where I'm sitting, spending potentially trillions of dollars for 8% of a solution is completely wild. And yet, proponents are still trying to spin the yarn that all the problem needs is more money, more of the public's money to keep proving that this solution doesn't exist. And in fact, if we were actually to build out all of the carbon capture and storage infrastructure that they are asking for, it would be wildly unrealistic. Princeton put out a study, the Net Zero America study that just came out last year, in which they theorized that they expect us to build more infrastructure to move CO2 than we have infrastructure right now to move oil and gas. It took us 100 years to build the infrastructure that you see here to move oil and gas, and they expect that within the next 20 years, we will build out more than that level of infrastructure to move just CO2. And what exactly does this look like in Louisiana? So I mentioned the Governor's Climate Initiatives Task Force. And a few weeks ago, some of us saw a presentation that was given to that task force in which they laid out some of the pathways toward greenhouse gas emissions reductions to keep the planet from warming too much, using modeling that's available globally for different policy options. The Water Institute actually presented to the Climate Task Force a number of scenarios for how we can reduce carbon emissions in Louisiana. Even under the most ambitious of quote unquote realistic scenarios for carbon capture and storage, while we end up with less CO2 in the air than doing nothing, it's still more CO2 than is in the air today, which you can see by that green line. The gray line on this graph is how much CO2 emissions will rise if we do nothing. And the green line is how much they will rise if we implement the largest possible feasible carbon capture and storage. And in fact, the scenario that did the most good that was presented in these models was rapid electrification to zero carbon renewable energy. But the oil and gas folks on the task force did not want to hear that. Y'all, they were very upset. It is clear that carbon capture and storage is much more about saving face than about reducing emissions. When the very models that are global standards for articulating how we get to even net zero or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, when those models are showing that carbon capture and storage is not feasible after decades of research, we have got to be looking at something else. And I said at the top that Louisiana is a target. What do I mean by saying Louisiana is a target? When they're talking about building out carbon capture and storage in the United States, they're talking about moving the nation's CO2 that is captured for use and storage to Louisiana. The focus is shifting from carbon capture and storage deployment nationwide to concentrated efforts down to where petrochemical and industrial infrastructure is already concentrated. As we know, in Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, that industrial infrastructure is concentrated here in the South. And there is very little carbon capture CO2 pipelines built out in the country right now. They are mostly in places where people don't live, but they are talking about building a new network of CO2 pipelines on top of the existing network of natural gas pipelines. They envision this massive new network taking over South Louisiana and Southeast and West Texas to transport CO2, either for what they call enhanced oil recovery, which is using CO2 to get more oil out of the ground. We'll talk about that more in a second. Or for storage in salt domes or saline formations along and off the coast of Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. And y'all, those pipelines are not safe. They want to build this network of pipelines right next door to heavily populated areas of the Gulf South. I mentioned that many of the existing CO2 pipelines, they're in West Texas in the Permian Basin, they're in Wyoming, they're in places where not a lot of people live. But this pipeline network runs right through. This is an image of the imagined CO2 pipeline network that proponents of carbon capture and storage are talking about building out by 2050. This pipeline network goes right through multiple population centers across the United States and particularly in the Gulf South. And these pipelines, as I said, are not safe. They are carrying CO2, which is an asphyxiant. They are carrying it at very low temperature and very high pressure. They are often also carrying hydrogen sulfide, which is corrosive. These industries could actually filter that hydrogen sulfide out of the CO2 before they put it in the pipeline, but they've judged that that's actually too expensive to do. So they run it all through the pipeline, which makes the pipelines much more likely to fail because hydrogen sulfide is corrosive. Now, some of y'all may have heard about failures of natural gas pipelines, right? We've heard, unfortunately, increasing stories around the US of natural gas pipelines leaking or causing explosions in which people lose their houses or, God forbid, lose their lives. CO2 pipelines fail differently. I'm actually going to transition out of the slideshow for 1 second because I want to show you a video of what happens when a CO2 pipeline fails. Now, this might be loud, so be ready to turn your volume down if you need to. We're going to watch a little video. Logan, can you confirm that you can see the video? Okay.
This video shows a rupture of a buried, dense phase carbon dioxide pipeline. The experiment was conducted in the safe environment of the DNVGL Spade Adam Testing and Research Centre to assess the consequences of such ruptures in terms of mass outflow, crater formation and dense gas dispersion. The viewer should note that the extent of the visible plume does not necessarily represent the extent of the dense gas hazard.
These pipelines do fail. And when they fail catastrophically. And we have got to keep in mind that this is what they want to put next to our homes and next to our families' homes. The people of Yazoo County, Mississippi actually know this firsthand. because a CO2 pipeline in southern Mississippi did fail last year. And the first responders who responded to the scene, having to evacuate hundreds of people, having to hospitalize dozens, they talked about people walking around like zombies, foaming at the mouth. That is what happens when people are exposed to what is in these pipelines when they fail. And in Louisiana, most of these pipelines will be built near communities that already essentially pay the most in safety. In Louisiana, that's going to be Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities first. But white and wealthy communities are not protected from these harms. Air and water pollution travels. We all deserve better than this. We all deserve a safer environment than this. Residents across the state will end up paying the cost, not just in safety and risk, but in actual dollars. We deserve to have the public's money invested in climate solutions that actually work. So far, of all of the tax credits that have supported carbon capture and storage, more than 80% of the existing carbon capture capacity is actually for enhanced oil recovery, not storage. That means that captured carbon is actually not going to just sit idly under the ground and not harm anyone anymore. It's going to pull more oil out of the ground. The process of capturing that garbage, the process of pulling the oil out of the ground, and then the process of burning that oil and gas that the CO2, that captured carbon is used to pull out of the ground, all of that has enormous greenhouse gas emissions impacts. So it doesn't even solve the problem. And what we're also seeing is that more than 80% of tax credits that have already gone for carbon capture and storage went to oil and gas companies. And what that means is that carbon capture and storage is actually a tax subsidy for oil companies. As I said, we deserve to have the public's money invested in climate solutions that actually work, not thrown at dangerous experiments, thrown at the companies that put us into this mess to keep testing things that don't work. $1 billion, $1 billion has already been invested by the federal government in these tax exemptions, and it's already gone to wasteful spending. And those costs are borne by ratepayers. If energy production, like whether it's gas-fired or coal-fired, if it has carbon capture and storage added onto it rather than switching to renewable, we, the people who pay our energy bills, will actually see that cost passed on to us. And in New Orleans, a lot of us are already on the hook for a gas-fired power plant that we don't need. And putting carbon capture and storage on top of that would raise our electricity bills even more. Not only that, capturing carbon only captures carbon. It doesn't actually address all of the other pollutants that the people of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and really across the country are asked to breathe in, often without public disclosure, every day. Again, we deserve a reduction on all emissions, not just carbon, and we deserve that reduction now. The polluting industries that are putting this stuff into the air have actually been responsible for over 10 million excess deaths around the world. And that number is 10 years old. That data is out of date now. We have lost people we loved to breathing in air pollution from these companies and from these industrial processes. And we need to be thinking about how to do this differently. And I've never felt surer than I do now when I say that fossil fuels, carbon capture and storage, and petrochemicals will not be the future of Louisiana's economy. Because this theory of carbon capture really is focusing on the wrong thing. The economy right now is not even good for these industries. They are suffering, and not just from COVID, but oil and gas was suffering from demand. They were shedding jobs. They were losing social license and political clout long before the pandemic hit. And focusing on carbon capture and storage is a last-ditch effort by oil and gas companies to prevent themselves from ruin in the face of both the climate crisis and our shifting energy needs. They have already abandoned us, and we need to be thinking about what we are doing differently. I said at the top of this presentation that it's not all bad news, that there are a lot of things that we can actually do collectively to stop the harm that is that global warming is causing and could still cause. But we have to do those things collectively. We have to talk to each other. We have to share what we're learning about the climate crisis and about the exploitative risks that are being pushed on us as solutions. And we have to come together to create people-driven solutions of our own.